They say you should never burn a bridge unless you're willing to see the other side go up in flames. My sister Clara handed me the torch and the gasoline, and then had the audacity to be surprised when I lit the match. For my entire life, I was the family's forgotten photograph. The one gathering dust in the attic while my younger sister was the framed portrait on the mantelpiece. She was the golden child, and I was the scapegoat, the convenient explanation for every problem, every financial strain, every dark cloud that passed over our family's perfectly curated sky. I spent 35 years accepting my role. I played the part of the long-suffering, quiet, accommodating older brother. I was the one who was supposed to shrink, to fade, to make myself smaller so her light could shine brighter. And it almost worked. They almost succeeded in erasing me completely. But then they made one fatal mistake. They took everything I had left, the one thing that wasn't just about my comfort, but about my survival, and they tried to buy a fairy tale with it. My sister stole the down payment for my house, my one shot at a life of my own for her wedding. Wait! Stop! I'm not saying this is a secret channel or anything. But if my voice sounds familiar, smash that subscribe button and hit the like button for a total stranger. And when I was asked to stand up and give a speech to celebrate her union, I decided it was finally time to read my receipts. Not just the financial ones, but the emotional ones too. This isn't just a story about money. It's a story about what happens when the person who has been silent for a lifetime finally decides to speak. And trust me, you're going to want to hear what I had to say. My days had a rhythm, a quiet discipline played out in a small apartment. My world was contained. The route to my steady but unremarkable office job, the comforting quiet of my living room, and the detailed blueprints I'd spend my evenings studying. At 35, I had a dream that felt both modest and monumental, to buy a small plot of land and build my own house. Not a mansion, but a home. Something that was mine, built with my own hands, a place where I could finally put down roots. My job as a city planner wasn't exactly a gold mine, so I had saved. For over a decade, every extra dollar, every small bonus, every careful budget surplus went into a single dedicated account. It was my down payment fund, my life raft, the tangible proof of my will to build a future. I found solace in my routines. The morning light in my small kitchen, the familiar weight of my gym bag, the smell of sawdust from the woodworking classes I took on weekends. These were the things that mattered, the small joys that composed my life. I had always believed, or perhaps forced myself to believe, in the goodness of my family. My sister Clara was a frequent visitor, though her visits often felt less like a reunion and more like a royal inspection. There was always a tension, a low hum of something unspoken beneath the surface of our polite conversations, a history of slights and dismissals that I had learned to swallow down like bitter medicine. But she was my sister, my only family, and I clung to that connection, wanting to believe it was real, that her care for me was more than just a performance of duty. Clara was a storm of a woman, all bright colors and loud laughter, and lately, the storm had intensified into a hurricane centered around one single event, her wedding. At 32, she had found her prince, a man with a wide smile and an even wider portfolio. No expense was being spared. The wedding was to be a spectacle, a testament to her success, her beauty, her ability to finally, deservedly, have it all. My small, quiet apartment became her secondary command center. She would sweep in, trailing fabric swatches and guest lists, her voice a constant chirping monologue about caterers and floral arrangements. "Jimmy, you simply must see the lace on this gown. It's imported from Belgium," she would say, holding up a phone with a picture of a dress that probably cost more than my car. She fussed over me, tidying my already neat apartment, her actions a perfect pantomime of a caring sister, but her eyes were always distant, her concern a thin veneer over a core of frantic self-absorption. I was a prop in her story, the stable, slightly tragic older brother whose presence at the wedding would add a touch of poignant family duty to the grand affair. Her concern felt cloying, suffocating, and deeply dismissive. She treated me not as a person, with a mind and a life of his own, but as a reliable piece of furniture, something to be dusted off and admired for its sturdiness, but ultimately taken for granted. Anytime I tried to bring up my own life, my own goals, the conversation was expertly, almost surgically redirected back to her. "I think I finally have enough saved for the land survey," I might say. "Oh, that's nice, honey," she would chirp, not looking up from a magazine of wedding venues. "Did I tell you we secured the Evergreen Manor? It has actual topiaries in the shape of swans. Can you imagine?" My dreams, my plans, my very existence were just minor inconveniences, brief interruptions in the grand opera of her wedding preparations. The unease in my chest grew tighter with each visit. It was a familiar feeling, the dull ache of being unseen, of being a secondary character in my own family's narrative. I was the reliable, stable, boring older brother. The one who never made waves, who dedicated his life to quiet diligence. And she was the star, the one who lived a big, dramatic life full of highs and lows that always, somehow, required my silent, unwavering support. This time, however, something felt different. The casualness of her dismissals felt sharper. The glittering excitement in her eyes held a manic edge that put me on guard. My quiet life was about to be disturbed by more than just conversations about ice sculptures and seating charts. A storm was coming, and I was standing right in its path. The email came on a Tuesday, a day like any other. The sun was casting long stripes across my desk at work. It was from the real estate agent, a cheerful woman I'd been working with for months. "Hi, Jimmy." It read, "Great news! That parcel of land you love just came back on the market. The seller is motivated, and if you can get the deposit over to the title company by the 14th of next month, I think we can lock it in at your initial offer." It was a routine email, a simple piece of professional correspondence, but it sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The 14th. It was sooner than I had anticipated. I replied immediately, confirming my interest, my hand trembling slightly as I typed. It was real. The thing I had been saving for, planning for, and quietly obsessing over was no longer an abstract concept on a distant horizon. It was here. I needed to make sure everything was in order. My house fund. I kept the bank statements in a neat file, but for the day-to-day balance, I used my laptop. That evening, I sat down at my desk, the familiar hum of the machine, a small comfort. I typed in the bank's web address, entered my username, my password, and watched the little circle spin as the page loaded. And then I saw it, the number. It had to be a mistake. A glitch in the system. I blinked, took off my glasses, wiped them on the hem of my shirt, and put them back on. The number was still there, 47.18. $47.18. My heart gave a painful lurch in my chest, a violent, sickening thud that echoed in my ears. It couldn't be right. There should have been over $100,000 in that account. A decade of scrimping and saving, a future, my future. I felt the blood drain from my face, my breath caught in my throat. I clicked on the transaction history tab, my fingers feeling like clumsy foreign objects on the keyboard. The page loaded, a long, neat column of dates and numbers. And there it was. Not a bank error, not a glitch. A series of large, systematic withdrawals over the past 3 months. $10,000 here, $15,000 there, another 10, another 20, each one a hammer blow, each one a nail in the coffin of my dream. The dates swam before my eyes, meaningless and yet horrifyingly specific. The last withdrawal, the one that had bled the account dry, had been made just last week. A quiet dread, the low hum that had been the background music to my life for months, now crescendoed into a deafening roar. The world tilted on its axis, the familiar comfort of my home, my sanctuary, suddenly feeling like a fragile, hollow stage set. I was no longer safe. I had been violated, robbed, not just of my money, but of my hope. And as I stared at the screen, at the stark, brutal numbers that spelled out my ruin, one single, terrible thought rose above the panic. Clara. I held the printout of the bank statement in my hand, the paper shaking, crinkling with the tremor of my rage and fear. It felt unreal, like a prop from a nightmare. I had to be wrong. There had to be an explanation, a scam, a sophisticated online phishing scheme, anything but the cold, hard suspicion that was taking root in my heart. I called her. My voice was thin, reedy, a stranger's voice. "Clara, can you come over? There's something I need to discuss with you." There was a put-upon sigh on the other end of the line. "Jimmy, is it important? I'm right in the middle of tasting cakes. You would not believe the difference between buttercream and Swiss meringue." My hand tightened on the paper. "Yes, Clara, it's important." She arrived an hour later, sweeping into my quiet living room like a burst of chaotic energy, leaving a trail of expensive perfume in her wake. She was wearing a cream-colored pantsuit, looking every bit the sophisticated bride-to-be. Honestly, Jimmy, this better be good. The baker was just explaining the structural integrity of a 5-tiered cake. I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I couldn't. The words were choking me. I held out the bank statement. "My house fund, Clara. It's gone." She took the paper from my hand, her perfectly manicured fingers brushing against mine. She glanced at it. A brief, dismissive scan. And then she smiled. It was a bright, dazzling, patronizing smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile she used when I was being silly or dramatic. It was a dagger of a smile designed to placate and dismiss in one fell swoop. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Jimmy," she laughed, a light tinkling sound that grated on my raw nerves. "You and your worrying. It's obviously a bank error. You know how incompetent they are. They probably mixed up your account with someone else's." The lie was so smooth, so practiced, it was almost impressive. She didn't flinch. She didn't even have the decency to look guilty. A bank error? For over $100,000, Clara, in multiple transactions over 3 months? My voice was rising, cracking with the strain. Honestly, you're getting yourself worked up over nothing, she said, waving a dismissive hand as if shooing away a fly. I'll sort it out. I'll call them first thing next week, after all this wedding madness has died down. We can't have you stressing. The sheer audacity of it stole the air from my lungs. Her eyes, those bright, clear eyes that I had known my whole life, slid away from mine, fixing on a point somewhere over my shoulder. She couldn't look at me. She couldn't look at me and maintain the lie. And in that moment, I knew with a certainty that was as cold and hard as a block of ice in my stomach. It wasn't a bank error. It wasn't a stranger. It was her. The casualness of the lie was more devastating than a screaming confession would have been. It told me everything I needed to know about how she saw me. I wasn't a brother. I was an obstacle, a resource, an inconvenience to be managed. The smile remained plastered on her face, a grotesque mask of false concern. Now, she said, her voice dropping into a conspiratorial whisper, let's not talk about boring bank mistakes. I need your final opinion on the groomsmen's ties. I'm torn between navy and charcoal. She left as she had arrived, in a whirlwind of self-importance, leaving me in the wreckage of her visit. The scent of her perfume lingered in the air, a cloying, suffocating reminder of her presence, of her betrayal. I didn't cry. The shock was too deep, the wound too precise for tears. Rage was a hot, roaring fire, but this was different. This was the chilling, absolute calm that follows a devastating explosion. I sank into my armchair, the silence of the apartment pressing in on me. The bank statement lay on the coffee table, a single sheet of paper that had detonated my world. For years, I had made excuses for her. She was younger. She was more ambitious. She lived in a faster, more demanding world. I had told myself that her self-absorption was just a personality quirk, that her dismissiveness was a sign of her busy life, not a reflection of her feelings for me. I had painted a portrait of a sister who deep down really did care. And with a few careless words and a patronizing smile, she had taken that portrait and slashed it to ribbons. That night, sleep was a distant country I couldn't reach. I sat in the dark, the apartment, a mausoleum of my old beliefs. The city lights streamed through the window, illuminating the wedding invitation that stood propped on my bookshelf. It was a thing of beauty, thick cream cardstock with elegant swirling calligraphy. It announced the union of Clara and her prince, a celebration of love and commitment. And at the bottom, a small handwritten note from my sister. Dearest Jimmy, I would be so honored if you would say a few words at the reception. A speech from my big brother would mean the world to me. A speech, the irony was so bitter it tasted like poison. She wanted me to stand up in front of all her friends, all her new family, and sing her praises. She wanted me to spin a tale of brotherly love, of shared memories, of lifelong devotion. She wanted me to be a part of the facade, to lend my quiet dignity and authenticity to her grand fraudulent performance. I looked from the invitation to the bank statement still lying on the table. One was a document of lies, the other a document of truth. And in the cold, quiet stillness of that night, a new feeling began to stir within me. It wasn't the familiar ache of resignation. It wasn't the sharp sting of hurt. It was something harder, something colder. It was resolve. I had been devalued. I had been deemed worthless, my life's dream less important than the canapes and champagne fountains at her reception. She had counted on my silence. She had counted on my weakness, my unwillingness to make a scene, my lifelong habit of keeping the peace at my own expense. She had made a calculation, and the result was that my dream was an acceptable loss. But her calculation was wrong. A plan, not yet fully formed, began to take root in the barren soil of my grief. It was a tiny, fragile seed, but it felt like the first thing that had been truly mine in a very long time. I would not go quietly. I would not fade away. I would give her the speech she asked for. But it would not be the one she was expecting. The grief, when it finally came, was a physical thing. It was a weight on my chest, a hollowness in my bones. I mourned not for the money, but for the sister I thought I had. I mourned for the 35 years of shared history that I now had to re-examine through a new, brutal lens. Every childhood memory, every shared secret, every moment of perceived closeness was now tainted, suspect. Was her hand on my shoulder a gesture of comfort, or a way to steady herself as she reached for my wallet? The betrayal forced me to look back, to see the pattern I had willfully ignored for decades. But grief is a paralyzing emotion, and I could not afford to be paralyzed. So I did the only thing I could think of to fight back the despair. I turned my grief into a project. The cold resolve that had sparked in the dead of night now bloomed into a meticulous, focused energy. My quiet life had a new purpose. It was no longer about blueprints and woodworking. It was about accounting. My career as a city planner had taught me one thing above all: the power of information, of records, of a well-kept archive. My apartment, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now became an evidence room. I started with the old hard drives in my closet. I pulled out shoeboxes filled with old bank statements, tax returns, and records dating back years. The faint, musty smell of old paper and electronics filled the air. It was a journey into my own financial history, a history that was inextricably linked with my sister's. I bought a new set of ledgers, the kind with crisp, clean columns. I sharpened a box of pencils. I brewed a pot of strong black coffee, and I began my work. This task became a different kind of therapy. It was a way to reclaim the truth from the fiction Clara had so carefully constructed. Each number I transcribed, each date I cross-referenced, was an act of defiance. It was draining, yes. Hours would pass in a blur of concentration. My eyes would burn from staring at tiny print on old statements and glowing screens. My back would ache from hunching over the dining room table, which had become my new workspace, but it was also invigorating. It sharpened my mind, gave me a focus outside of my own stolen dream and my sister's treachery. For the first time in a very long time, I felt a sense of control. Clara had taken my future, but she could not take my past. I would unearth it, I would document it, and I would understand it. I was no longer a passive victim of her whims. I was an auditor, and I was about to conduct the most important audit of my life. The columns in my new ledgers began to fill up, and as they did, a story emerged. It was not a story of brotherly love, but a long, slow, and calculated bleed. The numbers on the pages were like ghosts, haunting echoes of past betrayals I had chosen to forget or explain away. There was the $5,000 I had loaned her for a down payment on a car years ago, a loan that was never repaid, quietly fading from conversation until it was as if the money had never existed. There were the countless smaller sums, a few hundred here, 1,000 there, for a business opportunity that never materialized, for a rental deposit she was sure to get back, for an emergency that miraculously cleared up the moment my check was cashed. Each transaction was a small cut, a minor wound that I'd bandaged with forgiveness and denial. But seeing them all together, a long damning list of withdrawals from my life and my accounts, the individual cuts formed a mortal wound. It was a story of calculated deception, of a lifelong campaign of exploitation. I was forced to reevaluate everything. That time she had insisted on paying for a fancy dinner for my birthday. It was the same week I had given her $2,000 to fix her leaky roof. The beautiful, expensive watch she had bought me for Christmas one year, it was purchased with a credit card I later discovered she had opened in my name and then defaulted on, leaving a black mark on my own pristine credit. Moments I had cherished as signs of her generosity were in fact just the crumbs she threw back at me from the feast she was having at my expense. She was a financial vampire, and I had been her willing, or at least blissfully ignorant, source for decades. The grief I felt now was more profound than the initial shock of the empty house fund. That was a theft of money. This was a theft of my life's narrative. The sister I had loved, protected, and consistently forgiven was a fiction. The real Clara was the one reflected in these cold, hard numbers. She was a parasite, and her host was beginning to fight back. The realization was a heavy, suffocating blanket. I would sit at my table, staring at the evidence, and feel a wave of such profound loneliness it threatened to drown me. How could I have been so blind? How could I have allowed this to happen for so long? The language of therapy I'd read in books now came to mind with startling clarity. I wasn't just the responsible older brother. I was the enabler. I was part of the dysfunctional system. She was the narcissist, the golden child, and I was the family scapegoat, and the only way to stop the cycle was to break it completely. I mourned the woman I had called my sister, the one who existed only in my mind, and as I wrote down another date, another stolen sum, I knew that the woman in my memories had to be buried once and for all. The investigation was progressing, but I was hitting a wall. The older records were all on paper or in old files, easy for me to sift through. But the most recent, most damning transactions, the ones from my house fund, were purely digital. I could see the withdrawals, but I couldn't see where the money had gone. The bank's online portal was a labyrinth of security questions and two-factor authentications that felt designed to be impenetrable. I needed help, but who could I trust? The thought of involving anyone else, of airing my family's sordid, pathetic secrets, was mortifying. My pride, what little I had left of it, recoiled at the idea. But my resolve was stronger than my pride. There was only one person who came to mind, a long shot, a gamble, our younger cousin, Leo. Leo was a quiet young man of 22, a freelance coder and the antithesis of his cousin Clara. Where Clara was loud, Leo was reserved. Where she was flashy, he was modest. He had always been on the periphery of the family, an awkward but kind presence at holiday gatherings, usually found in a corner with his laptop, looking as though he wished he could disappear into the screen. I hadn't spoken to Leo in months, but I had his number. I stared at the phone for a long time, my thumb hovering over the call button. I was about to pull him into a war he didn't ask for, to pit him against his own cousin. Was it fair? The question gnawed at me. But then I looked at the ledger, at the sum total of Clara's theft, and I knew I had no other choice. This was about more than fairness. It was about survival. I called him. Leo, it's your cousin Jimmy. There was a surprise pause on the other end. Jimmy? Hey, is everything okay? His voice was hesitant, laced with a note of concern that felt genuine, so unlike his cousin's brittle performance of it. I took a deep breath. I decided not to reveal the full, ugly truth. Not yet. I would frame it as a problem of my own making. Oh, everything is fine, man. I was just hoping you might be able to help me with something. You know how hopeless I am with some of this online stuff? I'm trying to sort out my bank accounts, and I'm getting myself all tangled up. I was wondering if you might have a spare hour to come over and help an old man click the right buttons. He didn't hesitate. Of course, Jimmy. I can come by tomorrow after work. Is 5 o'clock okay? There was no sigh, no hint of reluctance, just a simple, unquestioning willingness to help. I felt a pang of guilt for the deception, but it was quickly replaced by a surge of gratitude. That would be awesome, Leo! Thank you. As I hung up the phone, I sensed that he knew on some level that this was about more than just a forgotten password. He had grown up in the shadow of Clara's personality. He knew better than anyone what she was capable of. He was a reluctant confidant, but he might just be the ally I so desperately needed. Leo arrived the next evening, punctual to the minute, holding a 6-pack of craft beer. I figured we might need some fuel for our great technological adventure, he said with a small, shy smile. His presence was calming, a stark contrast to his cousin's frenetic energy. I led him to the dining room table, where my laptop sat amidst the stacks of papers and ledgers. I had covered the ledgers with a tablecloth, hiding the full extent of my investigation. For now, he only needed to see the computer. It's this savings account, I began, my voice carefully calibrated to sound more confused than accusatory. I know there have been some large expenses, but the balance seems all wrong, and I can't for the life of me figure out how to view the transfer details. It keeps asking me for codes from my phone, and it's all just too much. Leo pulled up a chair and looked at the screen. He was patient and methodical, explaining each step as he went. He showed me how to access the more detailed transaction history, how to get past the security protocols that had stumped me. He didn't pry or ask what the large expenses were for. He simply did what I had asked. He helped me navigate the system, and then we found it. A section of the website I had never even seen labeled external transfers. With a few clicks, Leo opened a new page, and there it was. The final, damning evidence, laid out in undeniable black and white. My breath hitched. Leo must have heard it, because he glanced over at me, his brow furrowed with concern. Jimmy? I couldn't speak. I could only point at the screen. The transfers weren't just anonymous withdrawals, they were itemized. Transfer after transfer, perfectly matching the dates of the withdrawals I had found. And the recipients were not construction companies or real estate lawyers. The names mocked me from the screen. A 5-figure sum transferred to the Gilded Lily Catering. Another, even larger one, to Evergreen Manor, LLC. A third, shockingly large payment to Azure Horizons Travel Agency, with the memo line reading, Maldives Honeymoon Package, Clara Maxwell. Leo went still. The air in the room grew thick, heavy. He read the names on the screen, his face paling. He looked from the monitor to me, and in his eyes, I saw not shock, but a sort of weary, horrified resignation. He had not known the specifics, but he was not surprised by the crime itself. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it hung between us. To not only steal the money, but to transfer it directly to her wedding vendors, leaving a digital paper trail as clear as day. It wasn't just theft. It was an act of supreme arrogance. She truly believed she was untouchable. She believed I was too quiet, too passive, too stupid to ever figure it out. She believed I would simply accept her flimsy lie about a bank error. Leo slowly pushed his chair back from the table. He looked at me, his expression a mixture of pity and a slow-burning anger on my behalf. Jimmy, he said, his voice low and steady, what do you want to do? The question was simple, but the weight of it was immense. There was no turning back now. The whispers of suspicion had become a chorus of irrefutable proof. My resolve, which had been a cold, hard stone in my chest, now sharpened into a blade. The days leading up to the wedding took on a surreal quality. Armed with the undeniable proof of Clara's theft, the world seemed both sharper and more dreamlike. My grief and rage had been distilled into a single, clear purpose, and I moved through my days with a quiet, almost serene focus. My first task was to begin writing the speech, the one everyone, including Clara, expected me to give. I sat at my desk with a nice sheet of paper and a good pen. I tried to conjure the right words. I wrote about brotherhood, about the bond that time and distance could never break. I wrote about shared childhood memories, carefully selecting only the ones that could be polished into harmless, heartwarming anecdotes. The time we built a fort out of blankets, the way she held my hand on the first day of school. The words felt like ash in my mouth. Each sentence was a lie, a betrayal of my own reality. Clara has always had the biggest heart, I wrote, and the pen nearly snapped in my hand. She brings light and laughter wherever she goes. I looked at the words on the page, the neat script flowing across the paper, and I felt a wave of nausea. This was the performance she wanted, the final act of my lifelong role as the supportive, invisible brother. This speech was my silence, beautifully gift-wrapped. I set the page aside, unable to continue the fiction. I picked up a simple spiral-bound notepad, the kind you buy at a grocery store, and a plain ballpoint pen. And on this humble paper, I began to outline a different kind of speech. There were no flowery metaphors, no sentimental recollections. There were only columns and numbers. On the left side of the page, I wrote the dates of the withdrawals from my house fund. In the center, I wrote the exact amounts. And on the right, I wrote the names of the vendors the money had been transferred to. The Evergreen Manor, the Gilded Lily Catering, the Azure Horizons Travel Agency. It was a ledger of her crimes, a simple, factual accounting of her betrayal. I didn't need adjectives. The numbers spoke for themselves. They screamed. This document, this stark, unadorned list, felt more truthful, more real than any prose I could ever write about our supposed brotherly bond. I spent hours with both documents. The beautiful lie and the ugly truth. One represented the life I was supposed to pretend I had, a life of family harmony and mutual affection. The other represented the life I had actually lived, a life of quiet exploitation and hidden pain. The weight of those two pieces of paper felt immense. They were two different futures, two different versions of myself. One was the path of least resistance, the familiar road of swallowing my pain to maintain a fragile peace. The other was a path into an unknown wilderness, a path of confrontation and chaos, but also a path toward my own liberation. For the first time, the choice was mine. And as I looked at the list of numbers on my notepad, I knew which path I had to take. Just 2 days before the wedding, Clara descended upon my apartment in a flurry of last-minute preparations and bridal jitters. She was carrying a sleek, elegant suit bag. "Jimmy, darling, I have it," she sang, her voice echoing in my small hallway. She unzipped the bag with a flourish, revealing a tailored charcoal gray suit. It was beautiful, tasteful, and achingly expensive. "This is for you to wear on the big day," she announced, holding it up against me. "I had it specially chosen. The color will be perfect. We need you looking your best when you give your speech." The gesture, which a month ago might have touched me, now felt like a final, exquisitely cruel irony. She was dressing me up like a doll for her show, ensuring I looked the part of the distinguished, loving older brother. She wanted to wrap me in fine wool to soften the edges of my inconvenient reality. For a moment, just a fleeting, treacherous moment, my resolve wavered. I looked at her, at the genuine, unadulterated happiness radiating from her face. She was completely oblivious, cocooned in her own self-made fairy tale, a fairy tale purchased with my future. Was I really going to destroy this? Was I really going to detonate a bomb in the middle of her life? A life she had pursued with such relentless, single-minded determination? The familiar pull of keeping the peace, the ingrained habit of prioritizing her happiness over my own well-being, tugged at me like a powerful undertow. It would be so much easier to just let it go. To wear the suit, read the pretty lying speech, and swallow the poison one last time, I could retreat back into my quiet life, broken, but at least in one piece. The conflict, the ugliness, the fallout was exhausting just to contemplate. I could almost hear the whispers of my past self, the voice that had counseled silence for 35 years. "Don't make a scene. It's not worth the fight. Just let her be happy." Clara fussed with the suit, holding it against my shoulders, chattering on about the seating chart and how she'd place me at the head table right next to her new in-laws. "They are so excited to meet you, Jimmy. I've told them all about you, my wonderful, wise older brother." Her words were a physical blow. She wasn't just stealing from me. She was actively using a fictional version of me to build her new life, to impress her new family. She was curating my identity to suit her needs. That was the moment the fork in the road became crystal clear. The temptation to retreat vanished, burned away by a sudden hot flash of anger. This wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about my very existence. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in my bedroom, holding the charcoal suit against my body. The fabric was cool and smooth, a whisper of the luxury my money had bought. In the reflection, I saw what Clara saw, what the world saw, a quiet, unassuming man in his mid-30s, easily dismissed, easily forgotten. For decades, I had seen the same thing. I had accepted that reflection as the truth of who I was. But tonight, looking into my own eyes, I saw something else flicker to life behind the tired facade. I saw a spark. It was the planner who had faced down angry city councils. It was the young man who had managed his own finances, worked a steady job, and was trying to build his own life, however quiet it may have been. It was a person who had been systematically erased, his contributions ignored, his sacrifices taken for granted, his very essence drained away to feed the ego of another. The man in the mirror was not a victim. He was a survivor who had finally reached his breaking point. Clara didn't want me at her wedding. She wanted a symbol. She wanted the wonderful, wise older brother to stand up and validate her, to bless her union, to put the final perfect touch on her masterpiece of a life. She had given me a costume to wear and a script to read, and in that moment I decided I would no longer play the part. The peace I needed wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the presence of justice. The silence I craved wasn't the silence of a quiet apartment, but the silence that follows when the truth has finally been spoken aloud. I carefully, deliberately folded the beautiful suit. I didn't tear it or throw it on the floor. I folded it with a strange sense of reverence, as if I were handling a sacred object from a life that was no longer mine. Then, I walked to my closet, pulled out a large charity donation bag, and placed the suit inside. It would go to someone who needed it, someone for whom it would be a gift, not a costume. Then, I walked back to my dining room table. I picked up the folder that contained the bank statements, the transfer records, and the simple, handwritten ledger of my sister's crimes. The paper felt heavy in my hands, weighted with the truth. My heart was beating with a slow, steady rhythm. It felt stronger than it had in years. The point of no return had been reached, and I had crossed it not with fear, but with a profound and liberating sense of certainty. I was no longer just Jimmy, the quiet older brother. I was the keeper of the record, and the time for an accounting had come. The final preparations were a study in quiet precision. There was no rage, no frantic energy, just a calm, methodical execution of my plan. I went to the small copy shop in town, the one run by a kind man who always asked about my latest project. I stood at the self-service machine and made 3 identical sets of copies. First, the main bank statement from my house fund, showing the shocking final balance. Next, the detailed transaction history, a long list of large, round-numbered withdrawals. And finally, the crown jewels of my evidence, the printouts of the direct transfers to the wedding vendors. Each page that slid out of the machine, warm and smelling of toner, was a fresh indictment. I collated the pages carefully, ensuring they were in chronological order, telling the story from beginning to end. The narrative was stark, brutal, and undeniable. Back at home, I found one of the spare envelopes from Clara's wedding invitations. She had left a small stack on my hall table in case I thought of anyone else to invite. The irony was delicious. The envelope was made of the same thick, luxurious cream cardstock as the invitation itself. It felt heavy and important in my hand. Into this elegant envelope, I slipped one full set of the copied bank statements. It fit perfectly. This, I decided, would be my speech. These pages would be my toast to the happy couple. I didn't need to write a narrative. The numbers themselves were the most eloquent story I could ever tell. I sealed the envelope. I didn't write my name on it. I didn't write speech on it. It was anonymous, discreet, and looked for all the world like a wedding card containing a check or a heartfelt message. I placed the other 2 sets of copies into 2 separate manila envelopes. One was for the groom. The other was for his parents, who, according to Clara, were old money and terribly concerned with appearances and propriety. I wanted them to have their own copy of the truth, to read in the quiet, horrified aftermath that I knew was coming. I laid out my outfit for the next day. It was not the charcoal suit Clara had chosen. It was a simple dark navy suit I had owned for years. It was the suit of a man who was attending a funeral, not a wedding. A funeral for the sister I once thought I had, and a funeral for the timid man I used to be. The folder, my speech, sat on the table next to my keys. Looking at it, I felt no fear, no anxiety. Just the serene, steely calm of a person who has chosen their path and is ready to walk it no matter the consequences. The storm was about to break, and I was the one holding the lightning. The Evergreen Manor was even more opulent than Clara had described. It was a sprawling estate of stone and ivy, surrounded by acres of manicured lawns. A string quartet played classical music on a terrace overlooking a shimmering lake. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne and elaborate hors d'oeuvres. It was a scene of breathtaking beauty and staggering expense, and every petal of every perfect flower, every crystal flute of bubbling champagne felt like it had been bought with a piece of my life. I moved through the reception like a ghost, an observer from another world. I wore my simple navy suit, a stark island of dark blue in a sea of tuxedos and finery. People smiled at me, polite, curious smiles for the bride's older brother. "You must be Jimmy," one man, the groom's father, said, his hand firm and dry in mine. "Clara has told us so much about you. We're so thrilled to finally meet her brother." The praise almost made me laugh out loud. I was not just her brother. I was its silent, unacknowledged creditor. I nodded and smiled, a quiet, dignified portrait of the man they all believed me to be. "It's a beautiful wedding," I said, my voice even and calm. I watched Clara. She was radiant, a queen in her kingdom of white roses and shimmering lights. She laughed, she kissed her new husband, she accepted the effusive praise of her guests. She was the star of the show, utterly confident, utterly secure in her triumph. She caught my eye across the room and gave me a brilliant smile and a little wave, a gesture that said, "See? Isn't it all perfect?" She had no idea. The groom, a handsome man named Richard, seemed kind, if a little overwhelmed by the spectacle his new wife had orchestrated. He came over to me at one point, clapping me on the shoulder. "Jimmy, I'm so glad you could be here. It means the world to Clara. She speaks so highly of you, says you've been her rock her entire life." I looked into his honest, happy eyes and felt a flicker of something akin to pity. He was a victim in this too, a man who had unknowingly married a thief and a liar. He was about to have his own perfect day shattered, and he didn't even see it coming. The thought gave me no joy, only a sense of grim necessity. Finally, the clinking of a knife against a glass silenced the room. The best man, beaming, announced that it was time for the speeches. He gave a short, funny toast. The maid of honor, a woman dripping in sequins, gave a tearful, gushing one, and then the best man smiled and looked towards my table. "And now for a very special toast from someone who has known the bride her entire life. Please welcome Clara's beloved older brother, Jimmy." A wave of warm, polite applause washed over the room. All eyes turned to me. I saw Clara, her face glowing, her eyes shining with anticipation. She squeezed Richard's hand, whispering something in his ear. I picked up the elegant cream envelope from the table, my heart beating a slow, steady, powerful rhythm. I walked to the podium, my steps measured and certain. The room was filled with warmth, with affection, with the collective goodwill of 150 people celebrating what they believed to be a story of love. The performance was about to begin. I stood at the podium, the polished wood cool beneath my fingertips. I looked out at the sea of expectant faces, all smiling, all waiting for the heartwarming anecdotes and brotherly platitudes. I saw Clara dabbing a tear from the corner of her eye in anticipation. I saw her new husband Richard smiling proudly at his bride. I saw his parents at the head table looking at me with polite indulgence. I took a deep breath, letting the silence settle. Then, I opened the cream-colored envelope. I did not pull out a neatly written speech on cardstock. I pulled out the crisp, photocopied pages of the bank statements. I laid them flat on the podium. I began to speak. My voice did not shake. It was calm, clear, and factual, the voice of a planner reading a city ordinance. "Good evening, everyone!" My sister Clara asked me to say a few words today, and I wanted to share something from the heart. A story of family, of trust, and of accounting. A few people chuckled at the word accounting, assuming it was the start of a dry joke. This is the statement for the James Vance Housing Fund, account number ending in 4,582. I began, my voice even and steady as I held up the first page. As some of you know, I've been saving for over a decade to buy a piece of land and build a small home. It's been my life's dream. The room was still, the smiles just beginning to falter. A ripple of confusion spread from the front tables to the back. Clara's smile froze on her face. "Let's begin with March 12th of this year," I continued, my eyes fixed on the paper. "A withdrawal was made via online transfer for the sum of $10,000. An interesting coincidence, as on that very same day, a deposit for $10,000 was made to an entity called the Gilded Lily Catering." A collective gasp went through the room. I could hear the scrape of a chair as someone shifted uncomfortably. I did not look up. I simply moved to the next line item. "On April 20, a transfer of $25,000. The recipient? Evergreen Manor, LLC. The beautiful venue we are all enjoying this evening, paid for in full." Richard, the groom, slowly turned his head to look at Clara. Her face had gone from a bridal glow to a ghastly, chalky white. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes wide with dawning horror. I continued, my voice a relentless, emotionless metronome of truth. On April 20th, another withdrawal, $15,000. This one was transferred to a floral designer. Another $10,000 for the wedding planner. $5,000 for the string quartet, who played so beautifully earlier. The whispers were growing louder now. I could see phones being discreetly raised, their small red recording lights blinking in the dim reception hall. I was not just giving a speech. I was creating a public record. The warmth in the room had evaporated, replaced by a thick, freezing silence, punctuated only by my voice and the rustle of paper as I turned to the final, devastating page. I paused and took a sip of water, letting the weight of the information settle. The silence in the grand, beautifully decorated hall was absolute. It was no longer a celebration, it was a courtroom. And I was the star witness, presenting my evidence. I looked up from my papers for the first time, my eyes scanning the room. I saw stunned disbelief on the faces of the guests. I saw dawning, sickening comprehension on the face of the groom. And I saw pure, unadulterated panic in the eyes of my sister. Her mask of bridal bliss had shattered, and behind it was the ugly, terrified face of a common thief caught in the act. I met her gaze across the room. There was no love there, no history, just the cold, hard reality of what she had done. I then turned my attention to the head table, specifically to Richard's parents, who were staring at me, their faces pale masks of shock and dawning fury. They were people for whom legacy and reputation were everything, and they were just now realizing they had welcomed a viper into their family. My voice, when I spoke again, was still quiet, still measured, but it carried the weight of a judge delivering a verdict. The most significant withdrawal, however, came on May 17th. A sum of $35,700. This was transferred to the Azure Horizons travel agency. The memo on the transfer, and I quote, was Maldives honeymoon package, Clara Maxwell. Richard physically recoiled from his new wife, his chair scraping loudly on the floor as he pushed himself away from her. He looked at Clara, not with anger, but with a kind of profound, devastating disappointment. Clara? He whispered, the sound carrying in the dead silent room. What is he talking about? Clara was frozen, a statue of horror. She couldn't speak. She could only stare at me, her eyes pleading, threatening, and utterly defeated all at once. I saved my final line for last. I picked up the top page of the statement, the one I had started with. My sister wanted a fairy tale wedding, and as you can see, she spared no expense. She truly got everything she ever wanted. So, I would like to propose a toast. I raised my water glass. To the happy couple, and to the final closing balance of my housing fund, which as of this morning, stands at $47.18. I placed the papers neatly back into the cream-colored envelope, my hands perfectly steady. The speech was over. A single hysterical sob broke the silence. It was Clara. The dam had broken. The performance was over. My ledger was now public record. I didn't stay for the implosion. I had lit the fuse. I had no desire to stand and admire the explosion. My part was done. As the first shouts began to erupt, as the groom's father rose from his chair, his face a thundercloud of rage, I simply turned and walked away from the podium. No one tried to stop me. The guests were a frozen tableau of shock and horror, their eyes darting between me, the sobbing bride, and the utterly devastated groom. I walked down the center aisle, the same one Clara had glided down just hours before in her white gown, my simple navy suit a somber counterpoint to the memory. As I reached the grand entryway of the manor, the heavy oak doors opened for me. My cousin Leo was standing there, his car idling at the curb. He hadn't come to the ceremony, a decision I now understood was an act of quiet protest, but he had told me he would be there for me when I was ready to leave. He had known, without me saying a word, that I would need an exit strategy. He simply held the passenger door open for me. His face was grim, but his eyes held a profound, unwavering respect. I got into the car, and he closed the door, shutting out the sounds of the life I had just dismantled. The drive back to my small apartment was conducted in a silence that was not awkward or empty, but full of unspoken understanding. The city lights blurred past the window, a world away from the gilded cage I had just escaped. Leo kept his eyes on the road, his hands steady on the wheel. He didn't ask what had happened. He didn't need to. He had seen the truth on my dining room table days before. He had known what I was going to do. When he pulled up in front of my apartment building, he finally turned off the engine and looked at me. The streetlights cast long shadows across his young, serious face. For a long moment, he just looked at me, and I saw in his expression a grief for the family he was part of and a fierce, protective loyalty to the cousin he was just getting to know. "I'm glad you did that, Jimmy," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "It's what she deserved. It's what you deserved." A single tear, the first I had shed through this entire ordeal, traced a path down my cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or anger. It was a tear of relief, of validation. To be seen, truly seen, after a lifetime of being invisible, was the only absolution I had ever needed. Thank you, Leo, I whispered. For everything. He just nodded, a silent promise passing between us. We were family, a new one, forged not in blood and obligation, but in the fires of a shared, difficult truth. The aftermath was exactly as chaotic as one might expect. My phone rang incessantly for days, but I didn't answer. I knew it would be a cacophony of voices. Clara, alternating between shrieking rage and pathetic, tearful pleas. Her new husband, or perhaps by now her ex-husband, Richard, whose lawyers were likely already drawing up annulment papers. His parents demanding apologies, or perhaps even threatening legal action of their own. I wanted none of it. I had said everything that needed to be said on that podium. The family, the one I had known my whole life, was fractured, shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The fairy tale wedding had become a local legend, a cautionary tale whispered about at other, happier celebrations. But in the quiet of my home, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in years. It was the peace of a battle fought and won. It was the profound, soul-deep liberation that comes from speaking your truth, no matter the cost. The money was gone. My house fund was empty. My future dream, a terrifying open question. But as I sat in my armchair, the silence of the apartment was no longer oppressive. It was comforting. I had reclaimed something far more valuable than the money. I had reclaimed my dignity. I had reclaimed my voice. I had reclaimed my own story. A week after the wedding, a thick envelope arrived in the mail. It was from a law firm. Inside was a cashier's check from Richard's family. It was for the full amount that Clara had stolen, plus an additional sum that the enclosed letter stated was for inflicted emotional and psychological distress. The letter was short, formal, and ended with a sincere, almost heartbreaking apology for the deception and humiliation I had endured. They had seen the truth, and they had acted. The money was a tool, a means to an end, but in that moment it felt like justice. I could call the real estate agent. I could buy myself a future. But the real wealth I had gained was not the number in my bank account. The real wealth was the freedom. The freedom from a lifetime of being diminished, of being the designated emotional caretaker for a narcissist. The freedom from the weight of unspoken resentments and the corrosive acid of denial. The final scene of this chapter of my life is not one of drama or confrontation. It's a quiet one. It's me, months later, standing on a patch of earth that is finally mine. The sun is warm on my back, a gentle breeze rustling the architectural plans in my hand. Leo is beside me, helping me stake out the foundation. I am not just building a house of wood and nails. I am building a life. My future is uncertain, as all futures are, but for the first time in a very long time, it is entirely, unequivocally my own. So I ask you, what injustice have you remained silent about? What truth are you carrying that is begging to be spoken? Because my story is proof that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stand up, clear your throat, and read your receipts to the world.